How we became human, the longest story ever told. Chapter 1, Three Sets of Footprints. I want you to begin with a walk. Not a long one, just a few dozen steps across a flat patch of damp grey ground somewhere in what is now northern Tanzania. The air smells of ash, because a volcano a few miles off has been coughing out fine powder, and a little rain has fallen, and the powder has turned to something like wet cement. It is morning or maybe late afternoon, we will never know, and across this soft, treacherous surface, three creatures are walking. There are at least three of them, a larger one in front, a smaller one beside or just behind. And this is the detail that undoes me every single time: a third, smaller still, who at several points steps carefully into the larger one's footprints, placing its feet where the big one placed its feet, the way a child does, the way you did on a beach, holding someone's hand, trying to match a stride too long for you. They walk, they cross the ash, and then they are gone over the rise into a morning that ended before there were such things as days of the week or names or history. And the volcano coughs again and lays down another blanket of ash over the prints, soft on soft, and the sun bakes it and it sets like stone. And there those footprints stay, through the rise and fall of everything, through the birth and death of entire other kinds of human being, through ice ages, through the invention of fire and the wheel and the written word and the atom bomb. For 3.6 million years, I'll say that again, because the number is almost meaningless until you let it land. For over 3.5 million years, those footsteps wait in the dark, exactly as they were left. Until in the summer of 1976, a team of scientists at a site called Laetoli, some of them, the story goes, larking about, throwing dried elephant dung at each other across the dig, and one of them, a man named Andrew Hill, dives out of the way, lands face down in the dirt, and finds himself staring at the ground from about 6 inches away. And he sees, pressed into the ancient hardened ash, a shape he recognizes, a shape every one of us would recognize. The print of a heel, and the ball of a foot, and the push of a big toe. Now, I need you to understand what those footprints mean, because they are where our whole story begins, and they contain, already, 3.5 million years ago, almost everything I want to tell you about over the next couple of hours. The big toe is not sticking out to the side, the way it does on a chimpanzee, the way it does on a creature that grips branches. It is lined up neatly alongside the others, pointing forward. The weight comes down on the heel and rolls forward to the toe, heel strike to toe off, exactly the way your foot is built to do it. These are not the prints of an ape that has clambered down from a tree and is shuffling along on its knuckles. These are the tracks of something that walks, upright, on two legs, freely. Out in the open, away from the trees, in no apparent hurry. And it does this, and I cannot stress this enough, it does this with a brain barely larger than a chimpanzee's, the size of an orange. These walkers are not clever, not yet. They are not tool makers, as far as we can tell. They are not us. And yet I look at that third, small set of prints, stepping so carefully into the bigger ones, and I cannot help it. I see a family. I see somebody small keeping close. And I feel, across an abyss of time so deep it makes the pyramids look like they were built yesterday, a flicker of absolute recognition. I know you, I want to say to them. I don't know your name. I don't know if you were a mother and her children or three travelers thrown together. I will never know what you were running from or walking toward, but I know that walk. I have walked it. My children have walked it. You are mine somehow, and I am yours. That feeling, that electric jolt of contact across deep time, is the feeling I want this entire journey to give you, again and again, until it changes the way you see your own hands. Here is the question I want to hang over everything that follows. Those three at Laetoli were not alone. I don't just mean the three of them together. I mean that for almost the entire span of this story, the world held many kinds of human. Not one, many. Different species of upright, tool-shaping, fire-tending, dead-burying, possibly even art-making people, living at the same time, sometimes in the same valleys, sometimes. And we now know this for a fact. We have it written in our own blood, meeting one another and loving one another and having children together. There were the robust ones with the great crested skulls and jaws like nutcrackers. There were the tall striding travelers who first walked out of Africa. There were the powerful, big-brained, cold-loving people we call Neanderthals, who buried their dead and cared for their crippled. There were the Denisovans, a whole kind of human we discovered not from a skeleton, but from a single fingertip and the ghost of their DNA still echoing inside living people today. There were tiny humans, a meter tall, hunting dwarf elephants on an Indonesian island who survived into times so recent it makes your skin crawl. The human family was not a ladder, with us standing proudly on the top rung. It was a bush, a wild, branching, crowded thicket of cousins. And every single one of them is gone, except us. We are the last ones, the sole survivors. The only kind of human left on a planet that not so very long ago was crawling with us in all our beautiful variety. And the deepest, strangest, most haunting question in all of science, bigger, I think, than how the universe began, because this one is about us, is simply this. How did that happen? How did a flat-footed, orange-brained ape walking across a patch of ash become the one creature that would inherit the entire Earth, and stand here, alone, the last twig on a once mighty branch, asking where everybody went? That is the journey we are going to take together. From those footprints to you, listening to this right now. And I promise you, I promise, that by the time we reach the end, you will never look at your own thumb, or your own grandmother, or a campfire, or a stranger on a train, in quite the same way again. But before we can ask how we became the last ones, we have to ask something even more basic. Something that sounds impossible. How could we possibly know any of this? How do you read the story of a family that vanished millions of years ago, that left no books, no monuments, no words, nothing but a scatter of broken bones and a few footprints in the ash? That, it turns out, is one of the greatest detective stories ever told. Let me tell you how we learned to read the dead. Chapter 2: How to Read a Ghost. I want to be honest with you from the very first, because honesty is going to be the engine of this whole story, and it is going to make it more thrilling, not less. Almost everything I am about to tell you, we have had to wring out of almost nothing. Think about what we are actually working with. A human being dies on the African savannah 2 million years ago. In nearly every case, overwhelmingly, the rule and not the exception, that body is eaten, scattered. The bones are cracked for marrow by hyenas, bleached by the sun, trodden into the dust and gone, erased completely. The chance of any individual creature becoming a fossil, of lying down in just the right wet sediment, at just the right moment, and being buried gently enough and fast enough to turn slowly to stone over millions of years. That chance is so close to zero, it may as well be a miracle. And then that fossil has to survive, locked in rock, through eons of earthquakes and erosion. And then, the unlikeliest step of all, it has to be lying exposed on the surface of the ground, at the exact moment in the brief flicker of modern history, when a human being who knows what they are looking at happens to walk past and look down. When you understand that, you understand a strange and wonderful thing. The entire story of human origins, every textbook, every museum hall, every grand family tree is built from a quantity of physical evidence that, for the really deep stretches, you could lay out on a few large tables. We are reconstructing the most important story in the world from a handful of teeth, some skull fragments, the odd thigh bone, and those footprints. We are squinting at a vast dark landscape through a few tiny keyholes, sometimes millions of years apart, and trying to describe the whole. And here is the thing I find genuinely glorious about that, rather than discouraging. It means this is a live science. It means the picture lurches and transforms every few years when somebody, somewhere, looks down at the right moment. It means we get to stand at the very edge of what is known and look out into the fog and say, here is what we are sure of, here is our best guess, and here, marvelously, is what we still have no idea about. I am going to do that with you again and again. When I'm telling you something rock solid, I'll tell you. And when I'm telling you a beautiful story that the evidence only half supports, a contested theory, a wild idea, an irresistible legend, I am going to stop and say so every time. Not as a dull disclaimer, as part of the fun. Because the not knowing is not a hole in this story. The not knowing is the story. So how do we do it? How do we read a ghost? The first miracle is dating. For a long time, the great frustration was that you could find a bone, but you had no real idea how old it was. That changed with one of the most beautiful tricks in all of science, and it hangs on the fact that nature keeps a clock. Certain forms of certain elements are radioactive. They decay, they transform into other elements, at a rate so steady and so reliable you could set your watch by it, if your watch needed to run for 1 billion years. Volcanic rock, when it erupts and cools, traps a fresh supply of radioactive potassium. And from that instant, that potassium begins, atom by atom, to turn into argon gas, at a rate we know with great precision. So if you can measure how much has turned, you can read, straight off the rock, how long ago that rock was molten. And in East Africa, where so much of our story is set, the land has done us an extraordinary favor. The whole region is laced with the ash of ancient eruptions, layer upon layer of datable volcanic rock, stacked through the sediments like the pages of a book. So when a fossil is found sandwiched between two ash layers, you date the ash above and the ash below, and you have caught your creature between two dates, like a flower pressed between two pages. The ash above says 3.1 million years. The ash below says 3.3. And so your fossil, your once living person, lies somewhere in between. The dead, who could not tell us when they lived, are made to confess it by the rocks they are buried in. But dates are not the half of it. The real romance, and it is romance, I make no apology, is the hunt itself. Let me tell you about the most famous morning in the history of fossil hunting. It's November 1974 in a parched, eroded badland called Hadar in the Afar region of Ethiopia. A young American scientist named Donald Johanson has gone out for a survey in the punishing heat, and on the way back to the vehicle he glances down at a slope and sees a scrap of bone. A piece of an arm. He looks closer. There's a bit of skull, a bit of thigh, a bit of pelvis. And the more he looks, the more he sees, scattered down the slope, and a wild, almost unbearable possibility begins to dawn on him. These pieces go together. They are one individual, one body. Something almost never granted to people who hunt these creatures, who usually live and die on a single tooth. That night, back at the camp in the heat and the elation, they play a Beatles cassette over and over, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. And somebody says, half as a joke, why don't we call her Lucy? And the name sticks. And Lucy, a female of a species we call Australopithecus afarensis, who stood about 1 meter tall, who died around 3.2 million years ago, becomes, for a generation, the single most famous fossil on Earth, the grandmother of us all. We'll spend proper time with Lucy soon, because she has more to teach us than almost anyone in this story. I tell you the dung fight at Laetoli and the Beatles tape at Hadar for a reason. I want you to feel that this knowledge was not handed down on tablets from on high. It was clawed out of the dirt by sunburnt, exhausted, obsessive human beings who got incredibly lucky and then worked incredibly hard, and who wept, sometimes, over what they found. This is a human story about humans, told by humans all the way down. And then, and this is the part that genuinely keeps me up at night, there is the newest miracle of all. Because it turns out the dead did leave us a message after all. A message written not in stone, but in chemistry. Inside those old bones, in the very best cases, fragments of the original creature's DNA can survive, the actual genetic code of a person who died 40, 50, 160,000 years ago. And we have, in the last 20 years, learned to read it. We can now take a sliver of finger bone and recover from it the genome of a kind of human nobody even knew existed. We can hold up the DNA of a Neanderthal beside your own and see, written there, the night your ancestors and theirs spent together. We have, in a real and literal sense, learned to resurrect the dead, not their bodies, but their code, their deepest instructions, the recipe for building them. That revolution is so important and so recent that I'm going to give it a whole chapter of its own later on, near the end, once you've met all the players. For now, I just want you to hold the wonder of it. We started this chapter with almost nothing, a few bones, a footprint, a scatter of teeth. And we are going to end this journey having read the genetic blueprint of vanished humans and found it, still alive, hiding inside the cells of people walking around today. So we have our tools, the clock in the rock, the hunters in the dust, the message in the blood. Now let's use them. Let's go back past Lucy, past the footprints, all the way back to the very beginning, to the moment a particular kind of ape did something that no ape had ever quite done before. It stood up, and it stayed up. Chapter 3: The Apes Who Stood Up. Let me take you back about 7 million years. I want you to throw out, right now, the picture you almost certainly have in your head. You know the one. The famous cartoon, The March of Progress, a knuckle-walking ape on the left, and then a line of figures gradually standing taller, growing paler, losing their hair, until a confident modern man strides off the right-hand edge. That image is one of the most successful pieces of science illustration ever made, and it is almost entirely wrong. It has done more damage to people's understanding of how we came to be than almost anything else. Because evolution is not a march, there is no line. There is no goal up ahead that everyone is straining toward. Nobody was trying to become us. What actually happened looks nothing like a parade and everything like a bush, a wildly branching thicket of different species, sprouting and splitting and dying off, most of them going nowhere, a few of them by sheer chance leaving descendants. We are not the top of a ladder. We are the last living twig on one surviving branch of an enormous, mostly dead tree. And I think that is more astonishing than the ladder, not less. We were not inevitable. We were not the point. We are a lucky accident that survived. Hold on to that, because it is the truest single thing I can tell you about our origins. So 7 million years ago, somewhere in Africa, the lineage that leads to us splits away from the lineage that leads to modern chimpanzees. There was a last common ancestor, a creature that was the grandparent of both you and every chimp alive, and we have never found it, and we may never find it. It is one of the great missing characters of the whole drama. But shortly after that split, in the fossil record, strange and wonderful things start to appear. And what is so haunting about them is how uncertain they are. We are right at the foggy roots of the tree here, squinting at the most fragmentary scraps, and the scholars argue ferociously about almost everyone. There is Sahelanthropus, nicknamed Taumari, which means hope of life in the Goran language of Chad, where it was found, far to the west of the usual hunting grounds, out by the old shores of Lake Chad. Taumari is about 7 million years old, which is staggeringly ancient, right at the very dawn. And Taumari is essentially a skull crushed, distorted, squashed by the eons. And the great debate about Taumari hangs on a single feature, the hole at the base of the skull where the spinal cord goes up into the brain. In a creature that walks on all fours, that hole points backward, because the head is slung out in front on a horizontal neck. In a creature that walks upright, it points straight down because the head is balanced on top of a vertical spine. And in Taumari, the discoverers say it points down. It stood up 7 million years ago. Critics say the skull is too crushed to be sure, and maybe Taumari is just an old fossil ape, nothing to do with us. And I want to be straight with you, they might be right. This is exactly the foggy edge I promised you. We are squinting. Then there is Aurorin from Kenya, around 6 million years ago, known mostly from a few precious pieces of thigh bone, and those thigh bones, the experts argue, carry the telltale marks of carrying weight on two legs. And then, most wonderful of all, there is Ardi. Ardi, Ardipithecus ramidus, is a creature I find genuinely moving, and I want to slow down for her, because she is a glimpse into a world we almost never get to see. She lived 4.4 million years ago in what is now Ethiopia, and she is, remarkably, one of the most complete early skeletons we have, over 100 pieces, painstakingly recovered and reconstructed over 15 patient years before the world was even told she existed. And Ardi is a creature caught precisely in the act of becoming. Picture her, she lived not on open grassland but in woodland, among hackberry and fig and palm, in dappled shade by ancient rivers. Her brain is tiny, ape-sized, and her body is a glorious contradiction, a mosaic of two worlds. Her pelvis shows the beginnings of the reshaping you need to walk upright. But her foot still has a big toe that sticks out sideways, an opposable toe, a thumb on her foot for gripping branches. So here is a creature that could come down and walk about on two legs on the ground, and then go back up into the trees and grasp the limbs with all four hands. She has one foot, quite literally, in each world. She is not a missing link in a chain. She is something far more interesting. A real, whole animal, living a real life, balanced on the knife edge between the trees and the ground, with no idea whatsoever that she stood near the root of anything. And this brings us to the single most important and surprising fact about how we became human, a fact so counterintuitive that it overturned a century of assumptions. For a long, long time, everybody was sure that the thing that made us special, the big brain, came first. That our ancestors got clever, and then the cleverness led to everything else, the upright walking, the tools, all of it. Brains first. It just felt right. It flattered us. It is completely backwards. The brains came last. The walking came first, millions of years first. Ardi and Lucy after her, and all these early ancestors, they walked upright on two legs for 2, 3, 4 million years while their brains stayed the size of an orange. We were bipedal apes, upright, striding, free-handed apes, for an immense stretch of time before we were ever clever apes. The body was reorganized top to bottom, the whole skeleton rebuilt around standing up, long, long before there was any extra intelligence to show for it. Which raises the question that has obsessed scientists for over a century, the question that the footprints at Laetoli pose so beautifully and refuse to answer. If it wasn't for the big clever brain, then why? Why on earth would an ape stand up in the first place? Why would you give up the speed and safety of 4 legs and the easy life of the trees to totter about upright on 2? It sounds like a terrible idea. And working out why we did it turns out to be one of the most contested, most surprising mysteries in all of human evolution. So let's go and stand on 2 legs and feel how strange it really is. Chapter 4: The Mystery of the First Step. Stand up for a moment. Really, if you safely can, wherever you are, stand up and just feel it. You are right now performing a feat of balance so absurd that no engineer would ever design it on purpose. You are a tall, top-heavy column, your entire weight teetering on 2 small platforms, your center of gravity way up high, held over your feet by a constant, invisible, unconscious storm of tiny muscular corrections. You are in the lovely phrase, falling forward and catching yourself with every single step. A toddler spends a year learning to do this. Most animals never manage it at all, and we do it so well, so thoughtlessly, that we have utterly forgotten how bizarre it is. And it cost us. Make no mistake, standing up was not a free upgrade. Walking on two legs is, in 100 ways, a worse deal than walking on four. You are slower. A chimp can move faster than you, and a leopard vastly faster. You are more visible to predators, sticking up over the grass like a signpost. You can't climb nearly as well, so you've given up the trees, your oldest refuge. And the rearrangement of the skeleton to balance upright has saddled us, ever since, with a catalogue of miseries. Bad backs, dodgy knees, hernias, fallen arches. Worst of all, and we'll come back to this, because it matters enormously, it narrowed the birth canal, turning childbirth into something dangerous and agonizing in a way it simply isn't for most animals. Our species has paid for the upright walk in pain and blood, in every generation, right up to this morning in maternity wards all over the world. So the puzzle isn't just why did we stand up? It's why did we stand up despite all that? The advantage, whatever it was, had to be enormous to outweigh such a pile of costs. And here is the honest, slightly thrilling truth. We do not know what it was. We have instead a whole gallery of competing ideas, and I want to walk you through my favorites because the argument is gorgeous. For most of the 20th century, the favorite was the savanna hypothesis. The story went, the forests shrank, our ancestors were forced out onto the open grassland, and standing up was the way to cope out there. Maybe to see over the tall grass and spot predators. Maybe to stay cool, a clever scientist named Peter Wheeler worked out that an upright body in the midday tropics catches far less of the vertical sun and sits up in the cooler moving air, so a biped overheats less than a creature on all fours. Tidy. Dramatic. The naked ape walking out onto the savannah to claim its destiny. There's just one problem. Remember Ardi. Ardi was already walking upright, and Ardi lived in woodland in the dappled shade among the fig trees, not out on any open plain. The same turns out to be true of the other earliest walkers. The grassland came later. So the savanna hypothesis, in its grand old form, has the timing wrong. We were standing up in the woods before we ever moved out into the sun. The drama had the wrong backdrop. So the favorite has shifted, and I'll tell you the idea I find most persuasive, though I'll flag honestly that there is no consensus. It's almost embarrassingly humble. It's about reaching for food. Picture an ape in patchy woodland, where the good things, fruits, pods, tender shoots, grow scattered, at different heights, on bushes and low branches. An animal that can stand up steadily on two legs, freeing both hands to pick and gather and stuff its face, can simply harvest more efficiently than one that has to keep a hand on the ground. No grand destiny, no march toward greatness, just a slightly better way to eat your lunch, repeated over 1,000 generations, until standing up became the way your body was built. I find that wonderful, frankly, that the foundation stone of the entire human enterprise might be nothing nobler than a good snacking posture. And there are others. There's the carrying hypothesis, that standing up let us carry things, food back to share, tools from place to place, and above all babies, cradled in the arms instead of clinging to fur. There's even an idea about display, about standing tall to look impressive to mates and rivals, the way some apes rear up now. Most likely the truth is that it wasn't one reason at all, but several, braided together, pulling in the same direction over an immense span of time, with different pressures mattering more at different moments. Evolution rarely has a single clean cause. It has a weather system of causes. Now I promised you I would flag the legends and the fringe ideas clearly, with relish, and here is a perfect one. You may have heard of the aquatic ape hypothesis. The idea, which has had a long and glamorous life in popular books and television, is that our ancestors went through a watery phase, wading and swimming in shallow seas and lakes, and that this is why we stand upright, to keep our heads above water, why we're relatively hairless, why we have a layer of fat under the skin. It's a seductive story. It explains a lot in one neat sweep, and I have to be completely straight with you because protecting you from lovely nonsense is part of my job here. Mainstream science has examined it and set it firmly aside. The fossils don't support a watery phase. The earliest bipeds lived inland, in woodland. Other animals in those same habitats didn't take up walking on two legs. It persists because it's a good yarn, and good yarns are sticky. But it isn't where the evidence points. I tell you about it not because we should believe it, but because you'll meet it out in the world, and I'd rather you met it with me beside you, able to say, charming idea, clearly labeled, not established fact. Here is what I want you to carry out of this chapter, though, past all the competing theories. Whatever the reason, snacking, carrying, cooling, all of them at once we stood up, everything followed. Because standing up did one thing above all others. It freed the hands. Think about that. For the first time, a clever animal, well, a not yet clever animal, had two hands that were no longer needed for getting around. Two hands with their grasping fingers and their remarkable opposable thumbs, now available full-time for something else. To carry, to gather, to hold a baby, to pick up a stone, and to wonder what you might do with it. For 2, 3, 4 million years, those freed hands didn't do anything very dramatic. They picked fruit, they held infants, they got on with the ordinary business of being an upright ape. But the door was now open. The hands were free and waiting. And one day, and we can actually find the day, or near enough, in the dirt of an African lakeshore, one of those free hands was going to pick up a stone and strike it against another stone and change the trajectory of life on this planet forever. But before we get to that stone, I have to introduce you, properly, to the most famous member of our family, the little woman from Hadar. It's time to spend a proper hour with Lucy. Chapter 5. Lucy and the Long Childhood of Our Kind. I have a confession. Of all the characters in this entire enormous story, all the kings of bone and ash we're going to meet, Lucy is, I think, my favorite. And I want to try to tell you why, because it's not really about her fame. It's about what she lets us feel. She was small, a meter tall, about 3'7" fully grown. She weighed maybe 30 kilos, the weight of a child. She lived 3.2 million years ago in a green and watered Ethiopia very different from the Badlands where we found her. Her brain was about 400 cubic centimeters, the size, again, of a large orange, barely bigger than a chimpanzee's. By any measure of the thing we usually call intelligence, she was not remarkable. And yet when you stand in front of Lucy, or her cast, in a museum, something happens that almost never happens with a fossil. You don't think specimen. You think her. You think there you are. Because we have so much of her. 40% of a single skeleton, arms, legs, ribs, spine, that beautiful telltale pelvis. Enough that she stops being a fragment and becomes a body, and a body becomes a person. And her body tells us, beyond any argument, the great lesson we met in the last chapter, written now in indisputable bone. Lucy walked upright. Her pelvis is short and broad and bowl-shaped, swung around to balance her over her legs. Her thigh bones angle inward to bring her knees under her center, exactly as yours do, exactly as Ardi's were only starting to. She walked as surely as those three at Laetoli walked, because she was their kind. It was very likely people like Lucy who left those prints. She was an upright walker with the brain of an ape. The walking came first. She is the proof. But, and this is what I love about her, she was not finished with the trees. Look closer, and the mosaic is still there, just as it was in Ardi. Her arms are still a little long. Her finger bones are still a little curved, the curve you get from a lifetime of gripping branches. So picture her real life, walking confidently across the open ground by day, foraging, carrying, but still climbing up into the trees at night to sleep safe from the leopards and the saber-tooths, the way chimpanzees still build their nests up high. 1 foot on the ground, 1 foot in the canopy, a creature of the threshold. And here's something that breaks my heart a little and brings her terribly close. Look at Lucy's bones and you find injuries, fractures, in her arm, in her shoulder, of a particular kind. And one careful study has argued that these are the injuries you get from a fall, a bad fall, from a height. The grim, beautiful, awful possibility is that Lucy, this upright walker who still climbed, died the way a climber dies, that she fell, perhaps from one of those very nighttime trees, 3.2 million years ago, and that we found her, and gave her a beetle's song, and made her immortal. I want to be honest. That's an interpretation, not a certainty, and good scientists argue about it. But I think about it every time I see her. The first celebrity of the human story, and her fame may rest, in part, on a tragic afternoon by a river when something went wrong in the branches. Now Lucy was not one strange, lonely creature. Her kind, Australopithecus afarensis, were widespread and successful, and they lasted, as a species, for the better part of 1 million years. Let that sink in. 1 million years. We modern humans have been around, generously counted, for a third of that, and we're already terribly impressed with ourselves. Lucy's people endured in their woodland and grassland world for a span of time that should humble us. And we even have, from a nearby site, the bones of a whole group of them, adults and children together, more than a dozen individuals, nicknamed the First Family, who seem to have died in some single event, a flood perhaps, and been buried together. And we have, from a place called Dickica, the tiny, exquisite skeleton of an afarensis child, 3 years old, with a face and a little shoulder blade, a toddler from 3 million years ago, whom researchers nicknamed Selam, meaning peace. A child of Lucy's kind. You cannot look at that small face and keep your scientific distance. You just can't. I want to pull one thread out of all this, gently, because we are going to follow it all the way to the end of our story. It's the thread of childhood. Chimps grow up fast. A young chimp is clinging to its mother's fur within days, foraging for itself within a few years, independent and reproducing young. But somewhere along our line, childhood began to stretch, to get longer and longer and longer, because here's the bind that standing up created. Remember, bipedalism narrowed the pelvis, narrowed the birth canal. And at the same time, down the road, our brains were going to start ballooning, a narrow gate and an ever bigger head trying to pass through it. Something had to give, and what gave was this: our babies began to be born early, born helpless. Born, in a sense, unfinished, soft-skulled, useless, unable even to lift their own heads, requiring years and years and years of total care before they could fend for themselves. That sounds like a catastrophe, evolutionarily. It is a staggering cost, a parent, or several, tied down for over a decade keeping a helpless creature alive. But it turns out to be one of the great secret engines of everything human. Because a long, helpless, plastic childhood is a long, open window for learning. A chimp is mostly built at birth. A human child is a question waiting to be answered by its world, by its parents, its grandmother, its group, its culture. All those years of dependency are years of soaking up knowledge, language, skill, story, the accumulated wisdom of everyone who came before. The helplessness is the price. The learning is the prize, and the prize, in the end, is everything. We're going to come back to that long childhood again and again, when we talk about cooking and grandmothers and the explosion of art and culture right at the end. For now, just plant it in your mind as a seed. The creature that takes longest to grow up is the creature that can learn the most. That is us. That has been us since before we were clever, since Lucy was carrying a curved fingered, big-eyed baby through the Ethiopian woods 3.2 million years ago. Lucy and her people walked the earth for 1 million years and never made, as far as we know, a single deliberate tool. But the world was about to change. Because not far away, and not long after, in the bed of an ancient river, someone was about to pick up a stone and have an idea. Chapter 6: The Nutcracker Man and the Crowded Family. Before we follow that stone, I have to take you on a short detour, a detour into a dead end. And I want to take it, even though these creatures left no descendants, because they teach us the single most important lesson about the shape of our family, and because one of them has a face you will never forget. I told you the family was a bush, not a ladder. I want to show you now just how bushy. Because around 2.5 million years ago, the African landscape was not home to a single, lonely line of ancestors marching toward us. It was home to several kinds of upright ape, living at the same time, sometimes in the same valleys, breathing the same air, drinking from the same lakes. And one whole branch of them went off in a direction so strange and so specialized that they ended up looking like nothing alive today. We call them the robust Australopithecines, or Paranthropus, and the most spectacular of them goes by the wonderful nickname, the Nutcracker Man. Picture his skull because it's genuinely startling. Running along the very top, front to back, there is a bony ridge, a crest, like the crest on a gorilla, like the keel of a boat. That crest is an anchor. It's there to take the strain of jaw muscles so colossal they needed somewhere extra to attach. Below it, a face built like a machine for one purpose, chewing. Cheekbones flared out wide to make room for those vast muscles. A jaw like a vice. And the teeth, the molars, are enormous, broad as your thumbnail, paved with the thickest enamel of any creature in our whole family, the better to grind day after day, the toughest, hardest, most unpromising plant foods on the savannah. Roots, tubers, nuts, gritty seeds, the things nobody else could be bothered to eat. He was a specialist, a magnificent, over-engineered specialist. He found a way to make a living from food so coarse that it was, in effect, his and his alone, a niche no one else wanted, defended by a face built like industrial machinery. The first one was found by Mary Leakey at Olduvai Gorge in 1959, and it caused a sensation. Here was a hominin utterly unlike us, same deep roots, wildly different destiny. And here's the thing I want you to sit with. The Nutcracker Man, with his orange-sized brain and his nutcracker jaw, was a success. His kind lasted over 1 million years. By the brutal arithmetic of survival, he was doing fine for a very, very long time. He was not a failed experiment. He was a thriving, functioning, well-adapted kind of human cousin, getting on with his life right alongside other cousins who were doing something completely different. Because here is the fact that should give you chills. At Olduvai and at Lake Turkana, in the very same layers of rock, dated to the very same window of time, we find the bones of these robust nutcracker people and the bones of early members of our own genus, the first true Homo, and the stone tools somebody was making. Multiple kinds of human, side by side, not one after another up a ladder, all at once across the same landscape. Imagine standing in that valley 2 million years ago and seeing, in a single day's walk, two, maybe three different kinds of upright bipedal humanish creature. One of them squatting, methodically grinding roots between those great molars. Another, smaller-faced, crouched over a carcass with a sharp stone in its hand, sharing the world. We have no idea what they made of each other. Did they ignore one another, the way different antelope species graze the same plain? Did they compete? Did they fear each other? We will probably never know. But the world was full of us in our different forms, and that is the normal condition of our family across almost all of its history. The strange, lonely, single-species world you and I live in, one kind of human, and no other, is the freak. The exception, We are living in the strangest chapter, the one where, at the very end, only a single twig is left. And the robust cousins remind us of something else, something a little sobering, a warning we'll hear again at the end of this story. Specialization is a gamble. The Nutcracker man bet everything on being the best in the world at one particular thing, eating tough plants. And as long as the world stayed the way it was, he won that bet for 1,000,000 years. But when the climate lurched, as African climate did again and again, drying and wetting, swinging back and forth, the supreme specialist had nowhere to go. His magnificent machine was built for one job. He couldn't improvise. He couldn't switch. And so, around 1,000,000 years ago, the robust line simply ends. The crested skulls vanish from the rock. A successful kind of human, gone, leaving no children, because it had become too good at one thing in a world that refused to hold still. Hold that thought, because the cousins who didn't go all in on a single specialty, the ones who stayed flexible, jacks of all trades, generalists who could eat anything and adapt to anything, those are the ones whose story keeps going. And right at the heart of that flexibility, the thing that let one branch improvise its way through every climate swing the planet could throw at it, was a single, world-changing trick. Not a bigger jaw, not a tougher tooth. A tool. Let's finally go and pick up that stone. Chapter 7. The Cutting Edge. Here is a moment I would give almost anything to have witnessed. One of the genuine turning points in the history of life on Earth. And it happened, as far as we can tell, on the shore of a lake in what is now Kenya, and it happened like this. Creature, we are not even sure which kind, picks up a rounded stone, a cobble, picks up a second stone in the other hand, and brings the second down on the first at an angle hard, and a flake splits off. A sliver of rock, fresh broken, with an edge keener than anything in nature, sharper than a tooth, sharper than a claw. And the creature looks at this edge and somehow understands it. Understands that the stone broke that way because it was struck that way, that this can be done again, on purpose, whenever it's needed. That is not a small thing. That is one of the most profound cognitive leaps any animal has ever made. To strike a stone and make an edge is to hold, in your mind, a picture of a thing that does not yet exist, the sharp flake, and to know the sequence of actions that will bring it into being. It is planning. It is cause and effect. It is, in the most literal sense, the first technology. The first time a creature on this planet reached past its own body, past tooth and nail, and made something to extend itself. For a long time, we thought the oldest stone tools were about 2.5 million years old, and we credited them confidently to early members of our own genus, so confidently that when the first toolmaker was named, they called it Homo habilis, the handy man. Tools, we assumed, were our thing, the thing that set Homo apart, the badge of membership in the human club. And then, in 2015, a team surveying out near Lake Turkana took a wrong turn, got a little lost, and in a gully they shouldn't have been in, they found stone tools, deliberately struck, unmistakable tools. And when they dated the layers, the volcanic clock again, the answer came back, 3.3 million years old. 3.3 million. That's older than the genus Homo. That's older than the oldest tools by some 700,000 years. That's Lucy's era. These tools were being made by somebody who lived before our genus existed at all, by an Australopithecine, perhaps, or by that mysterious flat-faced cousin Kenyanthropus, or by something we haven't even named. The badge of the human club, it turns out, was being worn by creatures who weren't in the club. Tool-making did not begin with us. We inherited it from cousins with brains the size of oranges. I love that because it is so humbling and because it is so typical of this whole story. Every time we draw a proud line and say, this is what makes us special, the ground shifts and an older, stranger cousin steps across it. Now the next stage of tool-making, The one that really takes hold and sticks, we call the older one after Olduvai Gorge. From about 2.5 million years ago, these simple struck stone tools stop being occasional and start being a tradition, made the same way again and again across vast stretches of Africa for hundreds of thousands of years. And that word, tradition, matters enormously. It means the knowledge was being passed on, taught, held in the group, handed from one generation to the next, kept alive across time. A single clever animal making a single lucky flake is a curiosity. A technique transmitted down the centuries, taught by the skilled to the unskilled, that is the beginning of culture. That is the beginning of the thing that would eventually let us accumulate, generation by generation, everything from the hand axe to the spaceship. And what were the tools for? This is where it gets visceral and where it ties straight back to our bodies and our brains. Look at the animal bones from these ancient sites and you find, scratched into them, cut marks. The unmistakable scrapes of a stone edge slicing meat from bone. And you find something else. Bones cracked open deliberately by a hammerstone cracked to get at the marrow inside. This was a revolution in eating. Our ancestors were not great hunters yet. They were, as far as we can tell, a mix of hunters of small things and bold scavengers of large ones, darting in to strip a carcass that a lion or a saber-tooth had left. They had no great fangs, no claws, no killing bite. What they had, suddenly, was a knife. And a knife changes everything. A sharp flake can strip a carcass in minutes, get in, get the meat, get out before the hyenas arrive. And a hammerstone can crack open the long bones and the skull and release the marrow and the brain, rich, fatty, concentrated food that nothing else on the savannah could reach because nothing else could break in. We weren't strong. We weren't fast, but we could open the locked box. We could eat the food no one else could get to. And that calorie-dense, fat-rich, easily digested meat and marrow, prized out of the landscape by technology, that is one of the great keys to the door we are about to walk through. Because a brain is a monstrously expensive organ. It is greedy beyond all reason. Even now, yours is burning something like a fifth of all the energy you take in, just sitting there, just being a brain. You cannot grow and run a big brain on leaves and raw roots alone. The budget simply doesn't balance. You need a richer fuel. And right here, in these cut-marked bones and cracked-open marrow cavities, 2.5 million years ago, we can watch our ancestors tapping into exactly that richer fuel for the very first time. The hands were freed by standing up. The stone was picked up by the freed hands. The stone unlocked the food. And the food was about to unlock the brain. We have come to the threshold of our own genus. It's time to ask the hardest question in the whole story, harder than it sounds and stranger. When exactly did we become us? When did an Australopithecine become a human? Where in all this gradual becoming do you draw the line and call it Homo? Chapter 8, Drawing the Line. I want to ask you a question that sounds simple and turns out to be one of the deepest, most slippery questions in all of science. What makes something human? Not human in the modern you and me sense, we'll get there hours from now. I mean, what makes a creature a member of our genus Homo? Where is the line between an upright ape like Lucy and an early human? And the honest, slightly vertiginous answer is, there isn't one. There is no line. There is no morning when a Lucy gave birth to a human. There is no fence in the dirt with Australopithecines on one side and us on the other. There is only a gradual, blurry, maddening zone of change, stretching across hundreds of thousands of years, in which creatures slowly accumulate more and more of the features we associate with ourselves. And scientists argue, fiercely and endlessly, about exactly where to plant the flag and say, here it begins. Here is the dawn of Homo. I find this genuinely thrilling rather than frustrating, and I'll tell you why. It's because it's true. This is what evolution actually looks like up close. Not a series of clean steps, not a sequence of distinct creatures, but a smooth, continuous, flowing transformation, so gradual that any line you draw through it is a line you drew, a convenience, a human decision imposed on a seamless reality. The categories are ours. The flow is nature's. When you really grasp that, you've understood something profound about life itself, that the tidy boxes in the textbook are scaffolding we built, and the real thing pays them no mind at all. So what changes across that blurry zone? A few things slowly and not all at once, which is the whole problem. The brain creeps upward in size. The teeth and jaws shrink, that nutcracker machinery relaxes, because now you've got a stone knife to do the heavy processing your teeth used to do. The face gets flatter, less muzzle-like. And we used to say the tools appear, except, as we just saw, the tools jumped the gun by 1,000,000 years and ruined that nice, clean criterion entirely. The traditional first human is Homo habilis, the handy man we mentioned, named for those tools. A creature with a somewhat bigger brain than Lucy, somewhat smaller teeth, a flatter face, found at Olduvai and around Lake Turkana from a bit over 2 million years ago. And here's a measure of just how blurry that boundary is. Scientists genuinely cannot agree whether habilis belongs in our genus at all. Some look at it and see the first human. Others look at the same bones, the still long arms, the still curved fingers, the still smallish brain, and see just another Australopithecine that happened to make tools and want to kick it out of the club. The handy man has been on the membership committee's agenda for 60 years, and they still can't vote. That's not a failure of science. That's science being honest about a creature caught exactly halfway across a threshold that has no real edge. And then there's a single, humble, world-shifting little fossil I have to tell you about because it captures the whole mystery in one object. It was found in 2013 at a site called Ledi Geraru in Ethiopia. It is not a skull, not a skeleton. It is a piece of a lower jaw, half a mandible, with a few teeth still in it, small, easy to overlook. The kind of thing that, found by the wrong eyes, gets stepped over. But its age is what makes the heart race. 2.8 million years old. And that date drops it straight into the most tantalizing gap in our whole record, the dark, almost empty stretch between the last of Lucy's people and the first clear humans. A gap where, in a sense, the genus Homo is being born, and where, for a long time, we had almost nothing. And this jaw, this little jaw, sits right in the heart of that darkness, and it carries a mix of features, some still primitive, ancestral, Lucy-like, but some already shifting toward the human pattern in the shape of the teeth, the line of the jaw. It is a snapshot of the transition itself. A photograph, if you like, of the exact blurry moment we keep trying and failing to draw a line through. It says as plainly as a fossil can, it was happening here, around now, like this, gradually, in a jawbone in the dark. I want to step back and say something about all this drawing of lines, because it's a habit of mind I want you to carry through the rest of the journey. We are about to meet a whole cast of human kinds, Erectus, Heidelbergensis, Neanderthals, Denisovans, the hobbits, our own sapiens, and I am going to talk about them as separate species, with separate names, as if they were as distinct as cats and dogs. It's a useful way to talk, but I want you to hold it loosely. Because the deeper we dig, and especially once we get to the DNA, near the end, the more those crisp boundaries dissolve. We're going to find that these separate species met and mingled and had fertile children together and poured their bloodlines into one another in ways that make a mockery of the neat tree in the textbook. The truth is messier and webbier and far more intimate than separate species. The truth is a family that never quite stopped being one family. So, somewhere in that blurry zone, around 2 million years ago, in the bodies of creatures we squabble over how to name, our genus is taking shape. The brain is growing. The teeth are shrinking. The tools are sharpening. And then, fairly suddenly, by the standards of this glacial story, something genuinely new strides onto the stage. Taller, longer-legged, bigger-brained, built for the first time recognizably like you, a traveler. And the traveler is not going to stay in Africa. Chapter 9: The Traveler. In 1984, on the western side of Lake Turkana in Kenya, a team found something that almost never happens, the thing fossil hunters dream about and rarely get. Not a tooth, not a jaw. A nearly complete skeleton of a young human ancestor, 1.5 million years old. They called him the Turkana boy. He was a child when he died, around 8 to 10 years old by the look of his teeth and bones, and yet he already stood over 1.5 meters tall, 5'3". As a child, had he grown to adulthood, he'd have stood perhaps 6 feet. And when you lay out his skeleton and stand beside it, you feel a jolt of something you have not felt with any of the creatures we've met so far. You feel that's one of us, or very nearly. Because the Turkana boy belonged to Homo erectus, upright man, and Homo erectus is where the body becomes, at last, our body. Lucy was 1 meter tall, long-armed, short-legged, still half made for the trees. The Turkana boy is tall and long-legged and narrow-hipped and built, unmistakably for one thing, covering ground. For walking and walking and walking across open country all day in the heat. His legs are long levers for striding. His arms have lost the climber's reach. He's come down out of the trees for good, committed, fully, finally, to the ground. His shoulders are built for a thing no ape can do, and we do without thinking, throwing, hard and accurately. This is a creature you could, perhaps, dress in modern clothes and not look at twice from across a street. The ape is receding. The human is arriving. And inside that taller skull, the brain has grown to around 900 cubic centimeters, half again as big as Lucy's, climbing over Erectus's long reign toward 1,100–1,200. Not yet our size, yours is more like 1,300–1,400, but no longer an orange. Now it's getting serious. And with that bigger brain comes better technology, which we'll come to, and a richer diet, and very probably, though here I have to flag that we're inferring, not seeing, the beginnings of more complex social life, more planning, more cooperation. Maybe even the first glimmerings of something like fire, which deserves and will get its own chapter. There's a detail about the Turkana boy I can't leave out, because it pierces straight through 1.5 years and lands in the chest. We don't know exactly how he died. One reading of his bones suggests an infection, perhaps from an abscess. But here's the thing, he died young, and his body ended up in a marshy spot and was gently covered and preserved and waited for us. A boy, somebody's boy, out by the lake 1.5 years ago. We will never know if he was mourned. But I find I can't look at that small, tall, so nearly human skeleton without hoping that he was. Now let me tell you why Homo erectus is, for my money, one of the most underrated characters in the whole human story. Genuinely one of the great success stories of life on this planet, and almost nobody outside the field has heard of them. Homo erectus lasted in a way that should stop us in our tracks. They appear around 2 million years ago, and the last of them cling on a far Indonesian island, until perhaps 100,000 years ago, possibly later. That is a run of well over 1.5 million years. Compare that to us. Our own species, Homo sapiens, has existed for around 300,000 years. Homo erectus endured for roughly 5 times longer than we have managed so far, and the jury, you might say, is still very much out on us. We look at them, with their smaller brains and their unchanging tools, and we're tempted to feel superior. We should be careful. By the only test that ultimately counts, staying alive, as a kind, across deep time, Homo erectus has lapped us several times over. We have a very, very long way to go before we have earned the right to look down on them. And they did something else first, something that, more than the long legs or the bigger brain, announces the arrival of a truly new kind of creature in the world. They got restless. For 3 or 4 million years, every ancestor we've met has been African and only African. The whole story, from Taumui to Lucy to the handy man, plays out entirely within Africa. And then Homo erectus looks north, toward the edge of the only world any human had ever known, and walks out of it. They left Africa. They became the first human beings ever to set foot on another continent. And the moment they did, the human story stopped being an African story and became a planetary one. So let's follow them out across the land bridge, into a wider, colder, stranger world, on the first of the great human journeys. Chapter 10: The First Journey Out. There is a place in the country of Georgia, the one in the Caucasus, between the Black Sea and the Caspian, not the American state, called Dmanisi. It's a hill where a medieval town once stood, and beneath the medieval ruins, archaeologists found something that rewrote the timeline of the human adventure. They found human beings. Bones, skulls, several of them, beautifully preserved, and thousands of stone tools, and the butchered bones of the animals they ate. And the date came back, 1.8 million years ago, which means that almost as soon as Homo erectus existed, almost the moment this new long-legged traveling kind of human appeared in Africa, some of them had already walked all the way out of Africa, across the Sinai, up through the Middle East, into the mountains of the Caucasus. Far from any tropical home, into a land of real seasons, of genuine winters, of snow. I want you to feel how audacious that is. These were not modern humans. Their brains were smaller than ours. They had no tailored clothing that we know of, no certain control of fire, no maps, no writing, no idea that there was anything north of them at all. They had simple stone tools and their own 2 long legs and one another. And with that, just that, they walked off the edge of the only continent any human had ever lived on, and kept going, and survived in a cold and unfamiliar world, eating unfamiliar animals under unfamiliar stars. The sheer nerve of it, the first pioneers, and they had no idea they were pioneers. They were just following the next valley, and the next, and the herds and the water, the way living things do. And in doing so, without the faintest notion of it, they began the conquest of the planet. And the Dmanisi people have one more gift for us, one that lands us right back in the great theme of this whole story: how crowded and varied and untidy our family really is. Because those several skulls from Dmanisi, all found together, all from the same place and time, are wildly different from one another. One is big, one is small, one is oddly primitive, almost Australopithecine, with a tiny brain case. If you dug them up one at a time, in different places, you might well have called them different species. But here they are, together, one population. And there's a live and fascinating debate about what that means. Maybe a single kind of early human just naturally came in a huge range of shapes and sizes, far more variable than we'd assumed, which would be a warning to all those scientists busily splitting fossils into ever more species. Or maybe, and this is the wilder idea, more than one kind of human walked out of Africa together, mingled, traveled as a mixed band. Either way, the lesson is the same one the whole bush keeps teaching us. The closer you look, the messier and more interconnected it gets. Variation everywhere, clean lines nowhere. Once out, they spread astonishingly far. Homo erectus reached China, that's the famous Peking man, found in caves near Beijing. They reached the Indonesian island of Java, which is where the very first erectus fossil was discovered, back in the 1890s, by a Dutchman so convinced he would find the missing link in the East Indies that he went and did exactly that. They spread across an immense swathe of the Old World, from the edge of Europe to the Far East, and they settled in, and they stayed in some places, as we'll see, for an unimaginably long time, long enough to become something new and strange. And here's a thought I want to leave you with, because it reframes everything that's coming. From this point on, from about 1.8 million years ago, there is no longer a single stage for the human story. There are many. Africa keeps doing its thing, its restless cradle churning out new forms. But now there's also a Chinese story, and a Javanese story, and a European story, and a Middle Eastern story, all running at once in parallel, separated by thousands of miles and increasingly by hundreds of thousands of years. Different populations of humans, cut off in different corners of the world, each subjected to different climates and different pressures, each slowly drifting in its own direction, becoming different. This is the great branching. This is the bush throwing out its boughs across an entire planet. One of those isolated boughs, away in the cold north and west, in Ice Age Europe and Western Asia, is going to grow into the most famous of all our lost cousins, a powerful, big-brained, cold-hardened people who have been so badly misunderstood for so long that I consider it a personal mission to set the record straight. They've been called stupid, brutish, subhuman. They were nothing of the kind. It's time to meet the Neanderthals. Chapter 11: The Taming of Fire. I want to ask you to imagine the single most dangerous thing in the world to a wild animal. It isn't the predator in the dark, it's fire. Every creature on the savannah, faced with a wall of flame, does the only sane thing: it runs. Fire is death. It is the oldest terror there is, hardwired into everything that lives. And at some point, and we'll come to the maddening question of when one kind of animal stopped running, turned around, walked toward the fire, and unthinkably picked it up, learned to carry it and feed it and keep it and make it sit still in one place and work for them. No other animal in the 4 billion-year history of life on this planet has ever done that. Not one. The mastery of fire is, I think, along with that first struck flake of stone, one of the 2 or 3 most consequential things our ancestors ever did. It is the moment we stopped merely living in the world as we found it and started rebuilding it to suit ourselves. Now here is where I have to be honest with you, because the when of fire is one of the great, frustrating arguments in all of archaeology, and I'd rather argue it out with you than pretend it's settled. The trouble is that fire is shy. It doesn't fossilize. A campfire from 1 million years ago leaves almost nothing: a smear of ash, some scorched bone, a few reddened stones, and ash blows away, and floods wash burnt bone into caves, and a wildfire started by lightning looks to the spade much like a hearth. So separating humans' controlled fire here from something burned near here once is genuinely hard, and good scientists fight about almost every early site. There are tantalizing early hints. At Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, deep inside the cave, too deep for a wildfire to reach, there are burnt bones and ashed plants in layers 1 million years old, sitting right alongside stone tools. That's about as good as the early evidence gets, and many take it as the earliest solid sign of hominins using fire. There are older, shakier hints still, but the picture only really snaps into focus much later. By around 300 to 400,000 years ago, suddenly fire is everywhere, proper hearths, used over and over, in cave after cave across the Old World. At a site called Kesem in what is now Israel, there's a single spot in the cave floor where humans built fires in the same place, again and again, for tens of thousands of years, a deep stack of ash layers, one civilization's worth of evenings, all in one hearth. By then, there's no doubt at all. Fire has become home. So the honest shape of it is this: a long, dim, contested dawn, sparks of early use stretching back perhaps 1 million years or more, flickering and uncertain, and then, a few 100,000 years ago, the full sunrise, fire woven completely into daily human life. We are certain we ended up as the fire-keeping animal. Exactly when we crossed that line, we are still gloriously arguing about. But forget the dates for a moment and just feel what fire did, because it changed everything on every level at once. It changed the night. For every creature before us, nightfall meant blindness and terror. You found somewhere to hide and you waited, helpless, for the dawn, while the things with better night eyes hunted. Fire abolished that. Fire pushed back the dark, threw a ring of light and warmth around a patch of ground and said, "Here it is safe." The big cats that ruled the African night, the saber-tooths and the lions, fear flame and will not cross it. So for the first time, a band of slow, soft, fangless apes could sleep on the ground in the open, unafraid. The fire was a wall no predator would breach. It was the first home, and its only architecture was light. It changed the map. Warmth in a fist meant our ancestors could survive cold they had no fur for, could push north into Europe and Asia, into real winters, into the teeth of the Ice Age. Fire was the coat we wore before we had coats. It unlocked half the planet. And it changed time itself, the shape of the day. Before fire, the day ended when the light did. After fire, there was a new thing in the world, the evening. Hours of warm, lit, safe wakefulness after the sun was gone, with nothing pressing to do and nowhere you had to be. The band gathered close in the glow. And I am convinced, though now we're inferring, reaching past what the ash can prove, that those long firelit evenings are where so much of what we think of as human was incubated. The talk, the teaching. The passing down of how things are done, and who we are, and what happened long ago. Sit around a fire tonight, even now, even with everything we have, and feel how it pulls people into a circle, loosens the tongue, invites the story. That pull is unfathomably old. We have been gathering at that fire, telling each other who we are, for hundreds of thousands of years. We never really left it. But there is one more thing fire did, the most intimate thing of all, and the most surprising, and it is so important that one brilliant, controversial scientist has built an entire theory of human origins on it. Fire let us cook. And cooking, he argues, did not just feed us. Cooking made us, reached inside our very bodies and remade them. It's one of the boldest ideas in the whole field, and I find it irresistible, and I want to give it a chapter of its own. Let's talk about what happened when we first held food to the flame. Chapter 12: What Cooking Did. There's a primatologist at Harvard named Richard Wrangham who has spent his career on a single, audacious, beautiful idea, and whether or not he's entirely right, and we'll get to that, I think it's one of the most thought-provoking ideas anyone has had about how we became human. His claim, boiled right down, is this: cooking made us human. Not tools, not hunting, not language, cooking. The control of fire applied to food. That, he says, is the thing that turned a clever upright ape into us. Let me lay out his reasoning, because it's genuinely elegant. Start with a brain. Your brain is, frankly, an outrageous organ. It's about 2% of your body weight, and it devours something like a fifth, even a quarter, of all the energy you burn just idling, just being itself. It is a ferociously expensive thing to run. And across our story, as we've seen, this organ kept growing from Lucy's orange to Erectus's larger brain, on toward our own great bulging cortex. And every extra gram of it had to be paid for in calories every single day. So the deep question of human evolution is partly an accounting question. Where on earth did the energy come from to fund this absurd, gluttonous brain? You can't get it from raw food. Here's the thing most people never think about. Raw food is hard work. A gorilla, eating raw leaves and stems, has to chew for 6-8 hours a day and ferment the stuff in an enormous gut and still only just breaks even. If you tried to run your big human brain on a raw, wild diet, you'd have to eat almost constantly, and you still probably couldn't balance the books. Raw food is a low-grade fuel, and a lot of its energy is locked up where your body simply can't reach it. Now cook it. Cooking, Wrangham points out, is a kind of predigestion outside the body. Heat unravels proteins and makes them easy to break down. It bursts open the tough cell walls of plants and releases what's inside. It turns hard, indigestible starch into soft, available energy. It kills the parasites and the germs. A cooked meal gives up far more of its calories, far more easily than the same meal raw. Cooking, in effect, reaches into your food and unlocks the doors your gut can't open. Suddenly the books balance, and then some. Suddenly there's a surplus. Suddenly you can afford a bigger brain. And look, says Wrangham, at what cooking lets you stop spending on. If your food is pre-softened by fire, you no longer need the gorilla's giant fermenting gut, and the gut, like the brain, is hugely expensive to run. So you can shrink it. And indeed, when Homo erectus shows up, that's exactly what we see in the body: a smaller gut, a narrower waist, no more great ape pot-belly. You no longer need huge grinding teeth and a massive chewing apparatus, because the fire has done the pounding for you, and indeed the teeth and jaws shrink too. It's as if the body takes all the energy and machinery it once poured into processing raw food and reinvests it upstairs in the skull. Wrangham's lovely phrase for the trade is that we shrank the gut to grow the brain. The fire did the chewing and the fermenting, so the body could spend its budget on thinking instead. And there's a poignant little piece of evidence he points to. Take a chimpanzee or a bonobo and offer it cooked food versus raw. It chooses cooked, reliably. Apes seem to like cooked food the moment they meet it, to find it more delicious, more satisfying, even though no ape can make fire. As if the appetite for cooking was waiting in us, latent, long before we could do it. As if we were ready to fall in love with the campfire kitchen the instant it became possible. Now I promised you honesty, always, and here's where I have to deliver it. Because this gorgeous theory has a real problem, and it would be a betrayal not to tell you. The timing doesn't quite fit. Wrangham needs cooking to begin early, around the rise of Homo erectus, nearly 2 million years ago, to explain that body's smaller gut and growing brain. But remember the last chapter. The solid, unarguable evidence for controlled fire doesn't show up until much later, 1 million years ago at the very best, and only really abundant a few 100,000 years ago. There's a gap. A big, awkward million-year gap between when his theory needs the fires to be burning and when we can actually prove they were. And critics press on exactly this. Maybe, they say, it wasn't cooking that grew the early brain at all. Maybe it was simply more meat, more of that calorie-rich marrow and flesh the stone tools unlocked, eaten raw. Maybe fire came later and merely turbocharged a process already underway. So where does that leave us? Honestly, in a fascinating, unresolved place, which is exactly where I love to be. It is certain that cooking transformed us eventually. No one doubts that the fire-tending, food-roasting human is a fundamentally different animal from any raw-eating ape. What's genuinely up for grabs is whether cooking was the first cause, the prime mover that kicked off our brain's expansion, or a powerful accelerant that joined a fire already lit by meat and marrow and tools. The jury is out, the evidence is partial, and the argument is wonderful. Hold both halves at once. Cooking remade us for certain, and precisely when it started doing so, we still don't know. But I want to end this chapter by lifting our eyes from the calorie accounting, because cooking did something to us that has nothing to do with energy and everything to do with who we became. Cooking is slow. Unlike an ape which eats where it finds as it finds alone, a cooking creature has to wait. You gather the food and bring it back and tend the fire, and the meal is not ready yet, and so you sit together in the firelight and you wait for it together. Cooking forces a gathering. It creates a table, the oldest table in the world, a patch of ground around a flame. It demands that food be carried home and shared rather than gobbled on the spot. It builds, into the very rhythm of every single day, a moment when the band must come together and pause and share. I don't think it's too much to say that the family meal is hundreds of thousands of years old, and that we have been becoming human around that shared fire, waiting for the food together for almost our entire existence. And waiting together, sharing together, raising the helpless young together, that points us straight at the next piece of the puzzle. Because there was one member of that firelit circle whose role in making us human has been hiding in plain sight, overlooked for far too long. Not the mighty hunter, not the toolmaker, the grandmother. Chapter 13, The Grandmother. I want to tell you about one of my favorite ideas in all of human science, partly because it's brilliant, and partly because it takes something the world tends to dismiss. An old woman, past childbearing, no longer at the center of things, and reveals her instead as one of the secret architects of the entire human condition. It's called the grandmother hypothesis, and once you've heard it, you'll see grandmothers everywhere in our story. Start with a genuine puzzle, a thing about human beings so familiar you've probably never noticed how strange it is. Human women, almost uniquely among animals, stop being able to have children decades before they die. Menopause around the age of 50, and then, very often, 30, 40 more years of vigorous life. Now, from a cold evolutionary point of view that looks like a bug, even an absurdity. Evolution is supposed to be about leaving descendants. The whole machinery is tuned to reproduction. So why would natural selection ever build a creature that switches off its own reproduction with a third of its life still to run? Almost no other animal does this. Why us? Why would a long, healthy, non-reproductive old age ever be favored? The answer came, in large part, from years of patient fieldwork by an anthropologist named Kristen Hawkes and her colleagues, living among the Hadza, a people in Tanzania who still hunt and gather much as humans have for most of our existence. And Hawkes noticed something she wasn't expecting. She was watching who actually fed the children. And the hardest workers in the whole community, out every day, for long hours, digging up the deep, tough, energy-rich tubers that are a staple of the Hadza diet, were not young mothers. They were the old women, the grandmothers, tireless, expert, relentless, bringing in a surplus of food far beyond what they needed for themselves. And here's the pattern that cracked it open. When a Hadza mother has a new baby, she's suddenly consumed by the newborn nursing it, carrying it, and her ability to gather food for her older child collapses. And right at that moment, Hawkes found the older child's well-being, its growth, stops tracking the mother's foraging and starts tracking the grandmother's. It's the grandmother who steps into the gap. It's the grandmother, digging tubers in the heat, who keeps the weaned child fed and thriving while the mother is busy with the next one. And that unlocks something extraordinary about human reproduction. Other apes have to wait. A mother chimp can't have another baby until the last one is more or less independent, years apart, because she alone must feed it. But a human mother, backed by a grandmother, doesn't have to wait. She can wean one child early, hand its feeding to grandma, and get on with the next. Human mothers can stack their children, several dependent young at once, of different ages, overlapping, in a way no ape could ever afford because they are not doing it alone. There is a grandmother in the system, subsidizing the whole enterprise. Now follow the logic because it's beautiful, and it bites its own tail in the most satisfying way. Imagine, deep in our past, a woman who happens, through the luck of her genes, to stay strong and healthy a little longer than most, past her own childbearing years, but vigorous enough to forage hard and feed her grandchildren. Those grandchildren, better fed, survive at higher rates. And they carry her genes, including, crucially, the genes for that very longevity, that robust, useful old age. So those long life genes spread. Generation after generation, the grandmothers who lived longer and helped more left more descendants, who lived longer and helped more. And on selection quietly, relentlessly, stretching the human lifespan, building the long post-reproductive old age that is such a peculiar hallmark of our kind. In this telling, menopause isn't a failure or a winding down at all. It's a strategy, a reassignment, a switch from making new children to guaranteeing the survival of the ones already here. Grandmotherhood isn't the sad epilogue to a woman's reproductive life. It may be one of the engines that built human life as we know it. I have to be fair and tell you this is a hypothesis, not a closed case. It's argued over, as everything good in this field is. Some question how universal the pattern really is. But I love it, and I want it in this story, for two reasons that reach far beyond the technical debate. The first is that it pulls the whole shape of human life into focus. We are the creatures of the long childhood. Remember, all those years of helpless learning, the seed I planted back with Lucy. But you cannot afford a decade-long childhood unless someone is doing the extra work to feed all those slow-growing, expensive, dependent young. The long childhood and the long old age are two ends of the same bargain. The grandmother, freed from bearing her own babies, pays for the grandchild's endless, precious, knowledge-soaking youth. The old subsidize the young. Experience feeds growth. We didn't just evolve big brains and long childhoods. We evolved a kind of family, multiple generations, woven together, sharing the load that could afford them. And that, more than any tool or any fire, may be the truest shape of what we are. The second reason is simpler, and it's the through-line of this whole episode. We did not become human alone, not as lone hunters, not as solitary geniuses. We became human together in bands, across generations, the strong feeding the weak, the old feeding the young, the filet circle sharing out the food and the work and the stories. Cooperation isn't a nice optional extra layered on top of human nature. Cooperation is the foundation it's all built on. Keep that close, because right at the end of our journey, when we ask the hardest question, why did we survive when every other kind of human died, the answer is going to come back to exactly this. Not that we were stronger or even smarter, that we were better, somehow, at being together. And speaking of other kinds of human, it is finally time. We've built the body, freed the hands, sharpened the stone, lit the fire, set the table, woven the family. We've followed our restless cousins out of Africa and watched them scatter across the planet and begin, in their separate corners, to change. Now let's go and meet the most famous of them, the ones who got the cold north, the ones we got so wrong for so long. Let's go and meet the Neanderthals, and let's give them, at last, their due. Chapter 14. The Other Humans Meeting the Neanderthals. In August of 1856, in a limestone valley near Dusseldorf in Germany, quarry workers blasting out a cave threw a pile of old bones onto the rubble heap. Thick, strange, heavy bones, a curved skullcap with a heavy brow, some sturdy limb bones, and they nearly got tossed away as the remains of a cave bear. The valley was called, in German, the Neanderthal, the Neander Valley, and the bones from that valley would give their name to the most famous lost humans of all, the Neanderthals. Think about the timing. This was 1856, 3 years before Darwin published On the Origin of Species. The world had no framework, none, for what these bones were. The idea that there had ever been other kinds of human simply did not exist yet. And so, when the scientific establishment finally accepted that these were neither bare nor diseased modern man, but something genuinely other, they reached for the only story their age could imagine, that this was a brute. A lumbering, stooped, dim-witted, subhuman savage, the very image of everything primitive. The failed first draft that we, the triumphant final version, had rightly replaced. And that caricature stuck. It poisoned the popular imagination for 100 years and more. The word Neanderthal became, and still is, a playground insult, a byword for stupid, ugly, brutish, backward. It is, I think, one of the great injustices in the history of science, because almost none of it was true. And I want to spend this chapter and the next putting it right, because the real Neanderthals are not just more sympathetic than the cartoon. They are one of the most astonishing kinds of human that ever lived. And the more we learn, the more the gap between them and us narrows, until we have to ask whether there was ever really a gap at all. Let's start with that stooped brute image, because it has a wonderful, embarrassing origin. The famous early reconstruction, the shambling, bent-kneed, hunched-over Neanderthal of every old museum and cartoon, was based largely on a single skeleton, found at a French site called La Chapelle aux Saints. And that individual, it turned out decades later, was a particular old man, riddled with arthritis, his spine bent and his joints deformed by a lifetime of disease. They reconstructed the entire species from one arthritic pensioner, and then told the world that's how Neanderthals stood. It would be as if some future scientist dug up one elderly arthritic human and concluded that our entire species shuffled along stooped and crippled. Stand a healthy Neanderthal up straight, and he stands as straight as you do. So what were they really? They were a kind of human that split off from our line and spent hundreds of thousands of years mastering one of the harshest environments any human has ever faced: Ice Age Europe and Western Asia. And their bodies are a magnificent answer to that cold. They were shorter than us, but built, barrel-chested, broad, thick-boned, tremendously muscular, far stronger than any modern person. Short, compact limbs to hold in heat, a broad trunk, a big projecting nose that worked, very likely, as a magnificent air conditioner in reverse, warming and humidifying the freezing air before it reached the lungs. Everything about that body is engineered by hundreds of thousands of years of cold for surviving winters that would kill you or me in a night. They were not failed humans. They were superbly successful cold climate humans, perfectly tuned to a world of mammoth and woolly rhino and ice. And now the detail that should detonate the old caricature once and for all. Their brains. Neanderthal brains were not smaller than ours. They were, on average, larger. Bigger than yours, bigger than mine, among the biggest brains of any human that has ever lived. Now, brain size isn't everything, and the shape was a little different, theirs longer and lower, ours more globular, and we'll wonder later whether that shape difference mattered. But let's at least kill the cartoon stone dead. The stupid Neanderthal was carrying around more brain than the people who invented the insult. And what did they do with it? They were master hunters, and not timid scavengers, but bold, close-quarters killers of the largest and most dangerous animals in their world. We can read it in their skeletons. Their bones show a pattern of healed injuries, broken arms, cracked ribs, fractured skulls, that eerily most closely matches the injury pattern of modern rodeo riders. These were people who got up close and personal with animals the size of cars and wrestled them down with hand-held spears. That's not stupidity. That's a kind of courage most of us can barely imagine. They made fine, specialized stone tools of a tradition we call Mousterian. They hafted stone points onto wooden shafts, a multi-part technology requiring planning and foresight. They controlled fire completely. They made a kind of pitch glue from birch bark, which requires heating it in the absence of air to a controlled temperature. A genuinely sophisticated bit of chemistry that modern experimenters find tricky to reproduce. This was not a brute. This was a clever, powerful, skilled, deeply capable kind of human, thriving in a brutal world for far longer than our own kind has yet existed. But the tools and the hunting, impressive as they are not what move me most about the Neanderthals. Because the deeper we've dug, the more we've found signs of something else, something that reaches past mere survival, past cleverness, into the territory we like to imagine is ours and ours alone. signs that they felt grief, that they cared for their broken and their old, that they may have buried their dead with intention and perhaps even with tenderness. The question of whether Neanderthals had an inner life like ours, whether they mourned, whether they wondered, whether they made meaning, is one of the most haunting in all of this science. And it hangs, in part, on a single grave, in a cave in the mountains of Iraq, and on a scatter of ancient pollen that may, or may not, be the oldest flowers ever laid beside a body. Let me take you there. Chapter 15. The Flower Burial. High in the mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan there is a great cave called Shanidar, and in the 1950s and 60s an archaeologist named Ralph Solke dug there and found the remains of several Neanderthals. And what he found changed forever how we are allowed to think about them. One of those Neanderthals we call Shanidar one, and his bones tell a story that stops me cold every time. He was, when he died, an old man, old for a Neanderthal, and he was a wreck. His withered right arm had been useless for years, perhaps amputated, perhaps damaged from birth. He had a crushing injury to the side of his face that probably left him blind in one eye. He was deaf, most likely. His legs showed the marks of old, badly healed damage. He would have walked with a profound limp in pain. And here is the thing. He lived. He lived for years, perhaps decades, in that broken condition. A blind, half-crippled, one-armed, deaf old man in the brutal world of Ice Age Kurdistan, where every calorie was won by hard hunting. You do not survive like that alone. You cannot. Somebody fed him. Somebody protected him. Somebody chose, year after year, to carry a man who could contribute almost nothing to the daily fight for survival, to keep him warm and fed and alive, long past any cold calculation of his usefulness. That is care. That is compassion. That is, written in 50,000-year-old bone, a kind of human tenderness we had smugly assumed belonged only to us. The brutes, it turns out, looked after their broken. And then there is the most famous and most contested of the Shanidar finds, the one called, for half a century, the flower burial. In the soil around one of the buried Neanderthals, Solke's team found dense clumps of ancient pollen from bright wildflowers, yarrow and cornflower and others. And Solke proposed something beautiful and startling, that mourners had laid flowers in the grave. That 50,000 years ago, Neanderthals had buried one of their own on a bed of blossoms. Now I have to be honest with you here, because this is exactly the kind of irresistible story we have to handle with care. The flower burial has been fiercely debated. Critics pointed out that pollen can get into the ground other ways, burrowing rodents for one, stashing flower heads in their tunnels. The flowers might be nature's doing, not grief's. For years, the lovely image hung under a cloud of doubt. And that is the honest situation. We genuinely do not know for certain whether those were funeral flowers or an accident of biology. I will not tell you it is proven, because it isn't. But I will tell you this, because it is what makes the not knowing thrilling rather than disappointing. Recent excavations at Shanidar in the last few years have uncovered more, including a fresh Neanderthal skeleton deliberately placed in that same spot. And the careful new work increasingly suggests that, flowers or no flowers, these bodies were put there on purpose, with intention, in a place returned to again and again. The flowers remain uncertain. The burial, more and more, does not. They laid their dead to rest, deliberately, in a chosen place. And whether or not they scattered blossoms, the deeper truth stands. They did not simply discard their dead like rubbish or like meat. The dead mattered to them. And a creature to whom the dead matter is a creature with something we can only call a soul-deep inner life. It isn't only Shanidar. Across Neanderthal Europe, the evidence of an inner life keeps surfacing and keeps pushing back the date of modern behavior, sometimes past the arrival of our own kind. In Spanish caves, perforated shells worn as beads and mineral pigments, red and yellow ochre, mixed and stored in shells, 115,000 years ago, before modern humans were anywhere near Europe. That is jewelry. That is cosmetics or paint or symbol. There are claimed cave markings, geometric engravings that may be theirs. Each piece on its own can be argued about and is. But the weight of it accumulating has shifted the whole field. The Neanderthals decorated themselves. They used color. They cared for their sick and buried their dead. The cartoon brute is dead and buried himself, and good riddance. So here is where that leaves us, and it sharpens the central mystery to a fine point. If the Neanderthals were this capable, this strong, this clever, this caring, this human, then their disappearance becomes harder to explain, not easier. You cannot wave them away as a stupid evolutionary failure because they weren't stupid and they weren't failures. They were us, near enough, in a different body, which makes the question that has been building all journey almost unbearable. Why did they vanish and we remain? Hold that. We are nearly ready to face it. But the Neanderthals were not our only cousins in those final crowded millennia. There were others, stranger still, and one of them we met not by digging up a skeleton, but by reading a message inside a single broken fingertip. Chapter 16. The Ghost in the Cave and the Last of the Bush. In 2008, in a cave in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, a cave called Denisova, a Russian team dug up a tiny scrap of bone, the tip of a child's little finger, a pinky bone from a girl perhaps 5 to 7 years old. It is so small you could lose it in the palm of your hand. By every traditional method, it is useless, far too fragmentary to identify, just a nondescript chip. But this was the dawn of a new way of reading the dead, and someone thought to send that pinky chip to a laboratory, to the workshop of the man we'll properly meet in 2 chapters' time, Svante Paabo, and ask it to give up its DNA. And the genetic code that came back from that one tiny bone was not a Neanderthal's, and it was not a modern human's. It was something else. A whole new kind of human, previously unknown, unsuspected, undreamt of, discovered not from a skull, not from a skeleton, but from the chemistry inside a child's fingertip. We named them the Denisovans after the cave because we had nothing else to name them after. We had found an entire kind of human, and we could not even picture their face. I find that almost vertiginous, and it tells you everything about how strange this frontier has become. The Denisovans are, for the most part, a genome in search of a body, a ghost species, known overwhelmingly through their DNA, with only the barest scraps of bone, a few teeth, that finger, a jaw from the Tibetan plateau, found at high altitude where they had somehow learned to live in the thin, cold air. For years we knew their genetic code intimately and had almost no idea what they looked like. Scientists even tried to predict their appearance by reading chemical switches on their DNA, guessing at a wide face, a broad skull, a portrait sketched entirely from genetics, of a person no one had ever seen. And then came one of those moments that make this science feel like a detective novel. Back in the 1930s, in Harbin, in northeast China, a laborer had found a massive, magnificent human skull, and in the chaos of the Japanese occupation, hidden it down a well to keep it safe, where it stayed, secret, for some 80 years, until a dying man finally told his family. When that great skull finally reached scientists, it was so distinctive some named it a brand new species, Dragon Man. And then they pulled ancient molecules from it, and Dragon Man turned out to be a Denisovan. At last, a face for the ghost. The prediction from the chemistry was put to the test against a real skull, and it broadly held. We had reverse-engineered a vanished people from the code in a fingertip, and then, decades after it was pulled from a Chinese well, found their face. And the Denisovans were not the last of the strangeness, because the closer we get to the present, the busier the human world turns out to have been the bush in full, riotous flower, right up to the recent edge of time. On the Indonesian island of Flores, scientists found a kind of human that should not exist. Tiny, barely a meter tall, with a brain the size of a chimpanzee's, and yet making stone tools and hunting on their island as recently as 50,000 years ago. The world, inevitably and irresistibly, called them hobbits. They seem to be a case of island dwarfism, a population of humans, isolated on a small island with limited food and no large predators, shrinking over many generations, the way island creatures so often do. A real, miniature, too-losing kind of human, hunting dwarf elephants in the tropics, while Neanderthals hunted mammoth in the freezing north. And here is a detail I cannot resist, clearly flagged as folklore, not fact. The local people of Flores have long told stories of the Ebu Gogo, small, hairy, cave-dwelling, human-like creatures said to have lived in the forests within cultural memory. It is deeply tempting to wonder whether such legends could be a faint folk, echo of real encounters with the little people of the island. It is a wonderful thought. It is almost certainly only a wonderful thought. The timing doesn't really work, and most scholars set the connection aside. But I tell it to you because the temptation itself is part of the wonder, and because the line between our myths and our deep history is sometimes thinner and stranger than we expect. There was more, another small, primitive kind of human Naledi in a South African cave. Another Luzonensis on an island in the Philippines. Stand at a point around 50,000 years ago and look across the planet, and you would see at least 5 or 6 different kinds of human alive at the very same time. Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans across Asia, hobbits on Flores, the little people of Luzon, the last of Erectus perhaps lingering somewhere. And newly arrived on the scene, spreading fast, a tall, slender, restless African newcomer. Us. The world had never been more crowded with kinds of human, and it would never be so again. Because within a geological blink of that moment, every single one of those other kinds would be gone, and only the newcomer would remain. So it is time, at last, to meet the newcomer properly. It is time to ask where we came from, and what, if anything, truly set us apart. Chapter 17. Our Own Beginning and the Spark. For a long time we had a tidy story about our own origins. Modern humans, we said, were born in one place, East Africa, the famous cradle, at one moment, around 200,000 years ago, fully formed, and from there spread out to inherit the earth. A clean birth in a single cradle. It was a good story. And then in 2017 it broke. At a site called Jebel Irhoud, not in East Africa at all, but in Morocco, far to the northwest, scientists redated a set of human fossils and got an answer that stunned everyone: 300,000 years old. 100,000 years older than the supposed cradle, and on the wrong side of the continent. And the fossils themselves told a strange, double story. The face, flat, small, tucked in, looked startlingly like ours. But the brain case behind it was still long and low, archaic, not yet the high round dome we carry. A modern face on an old-fashioned skull. We did not, it turns out, appear all at once finished. We were assembled, feature by feature, the modern face arriving before the modern skull, the package coming together in pieces over a vast span of time. And where did this assembling happen? Not in one cradle. The new picture, and I find it far more beautiful than the old one, is that our species emerged across the whole of Africa at once. Picture scattered populations spread over an entire continent, separated by deserts and forests and distance, each drifting a little in its own direction. And then, as the African climate swung wet and dry, these populations repeatedly breaking apart and flowing back together, meeting, mixing, trading genes and ideas, then separating again. We are not the children of a single cradle. We are the children of a continent-sized conversation, a braided river of populations, weaving together and apart over hundreds of thousands of years, until out of that long mingling, the thing we call a modern human gradually crystallized. Even our own origin, it turns out, is not a ladder or a single point. It is a web. The bush, branching and rejoining all the way down. But a modern body is not the real mystery. Here is the real mystery, the one that matters most. When did we start to have a modern mind? Because somewhere along the way, this African animal began to do something that, as far as we can tell, nothing in the previous 4 billion years of life had ever done. It began to make symbols, to make one thing stand for another, to make meaning. Go to Blombo's cave on the southern coast of South Africa. There in layers around 70 to 100,000 years old are little sea snail shells, each pierced through in the same spot and worn smooth beads, strung and worn, the oldest jewelry in the world. And there is a small piece of red ochre, deliberately ground flat, and incised with a careful cross-hatched pattern, neat diagonal lines in a grid. It is not a tool. It does nothing useful. It is a design. Somebody, 90,000 years ago, made a pattern simply because it meant something, or pleased them, or marked something as theirs. That little cross-hatched stone may be the oldest drawing on Earth, the first time a human hand made a mark that stood for an idea instead of doing a job. And once it begins, it pours out. A carved figure from a German cave around 40,000 years old, a standing creature with the body of a man and the head of a lion, patiently carved from mammoth ivory. Stop and think about what that is. There is no lion man in nature. Nobody ever saw one. To carve it, someone had to imagine a thing that does not exist, to combine man and beast in the mind alone, and then make it real. That is pure imagination made solid. That is myth, perhaps a god, perhaps a spirit, 35,000 years before the first temple. And in caves from Spain to Indonesia, hands, hundreds of them, stenciled onto the rock, where someone pressed a palm to the stone and blue-red pigment around it, leaving a print that says, across the abyss, the simplest and most piercing message in all of human history: I was here. I existed. And the very oldest of those, we now know, are not in Europe at all, but on a faraway Indonesian island, including a painted scene of figures hunting a wild pig that may be the oldest story ever told on a wall. Art did not switch on in one place. It lit up like dawn wherever our kind walked. So was there a single magic moment, a sudden spark, a mutation, a switch flipped in the brain around 50,000 years ago that turned clever animals into symbolic, artistic, fully modern minds? Some scientists have argued exactly that. Others argue just as fiercely that there was no switch at all, that the evidence from Africa shows these capacities emerging slowly, patchily, in fits and starts, over hundreds of thousands of years, flickering on and off long before they caught and held. I'll be honest, that debate is unresolved, and it's one of the liveliest in the field. We can't even agree when language, the deepest symbolic act of all, truly began, because language doesn't fossilize. It leaves no bones. My own sense, for what it's worth, is that there was no single magic instant, that becoming mentally modern, like becoming human in the first place, was a long, uneven, gradual dawn, not the flick of a switch. But I hold it loosely, because here, as everywhere, the fog is real, and the honest thing is to say so. What is not in doubt is the result. By 40 or 50,000 years ago, our kind was making art and music and ornament and myth, and almost certainly fully complex language, pouring out symbols, telling stories, accumulating culture at a pace nothing before us had ever approached. And it was right at that moment, armed with that we walked out of Africa for the last time, and out across the whole world, and into the lands where the other kinds of humans still lived. And what happened in that meeting between us and them is the climax of our entire story. To understand it, we need one last tool, the most powerful one of all. We need to learn to read the message hidden inside the blood. Chapter 18. Reading the Dead and the Ghosts Within. I want to introduce you, properly now, to the man who did what everyone said could not be done. His name is Svante Paabo, and he is, to my mind, one of the great scientific heroes of our age, a Swedish scientist who spent decades chasing something his colleagues thought was a fantasy, the dream of reading the DNA of the long dead. Because DNA is fragile. The moment a creature dies, its genetic code begins to shatter, broken into ever smaller fragments, chemically scrambled, swamped by the DNA of the bacteria and fungi that consume the body, contaminated by the touch of every modern hand. In the 1990s, the consensus was flat. Getting a real genome out of a 40,000-year-old bone was impossible. There was nothing left to read, and what little there was, you could never untangle from the contamination. Paabo himself put it plainly. Most of his colleagues, he said, thought he was crazy. He was not crazy. He was patient and meticulous and stubborn and right. He built sealed, ultra-clean laboratories to keep modern contamination out. He developed ways to recognize genuinely ancient DNA by a telltale pattern of chemical damage that only accumulates over tens of thousands of years, a molecular timestamp, proof a sequence was truly old. And in 2010, his team did the impossible. They published the genome of a Neanderthal, reconstructed, fragment by painstaking fragment from crushed and ancient bone. We could, at last, read the genetic code of another kind of human. In 2022, Svante Paabo was awarded the Nobel Prize for it. We had learned to resurrect the dead, not their bodies, but their deepest instructions. And what those resurrected instructions told us rewrote the human story, and rewrote you, personally, in the telling. Because here is what they found when they held the Neanderthal genome up against the genomes of living people. They expected the Neanderthals to be entirely separate, a vanished side branch, gone without issue. Instead, the comparison threw up a signal that, the first time you grasp it, raises the hair on your arms. People of non-African descent, Europeans, Asians, and their descendants all over the world, carry small but unmistakable pieces of Neanderthal DNA inside them. Right now. Today, around 1 to 2% of the genome of billions of living people is Neanderthal. There is only one way that DNA could get there. Our ancestors and the Neanderthals did not merely meet when modern humans came out of Africa into the Neanderthals' world. They had children together. They loved across the species line, or at least they bred across it, and those children were raised and grew up and had children of their own, and their bloodline ran down through 40,000 years, through countless generations, all the way to a vast share of the people alive today. If you are of non-African descent, there is a Neanderthal somewhere far back in your family tree, not a metaphor, a literal ancestor. You carry them in your cells. They are in the most concrete way imaginable, not entirely gone, they are inside you. And it wasn't only Neanderthals. Remember the Denisovans, the ghost from the fingertip. Their DNA is in living people too, especially in the peoples of New Guinea, Australia, and the Pacific Islands, who carry several % of Denisovan ancestry. And here is my favorite single fact in all of human genetics, because it is so generous, so unexpectedly kind. The people of Tibet thrive at brutal altitude, where the thin air starves most of us of oxygen, and they do it thanks to a particular version of a particular gene that keeps their blood from thickening dangerously. Where did that priceless, life-giving gene come from? From the Denisovans. A vanished kind of human who had themselves adapted to the high cold air of Asia, reached forward across tens of thousands of years and handed a gift to people not yet born, the ability to live on the roof of the world. The dead are not done helping the living. They left presence in our blood. The picture has only grown stranger and webbier. We've found a bone in Denisova cave that turned out to belong to a girl whose mother was a Neanderthal and whose father was a Denisovan, a first-generation child of two different kinds of human, two vanished species meeting in one little body. We've found statistical ghosts in the DNA of living Africans, signs of interbreeding with yet more archaic populations we have never found a single fossil of, kinds of human known only as a whisper in the genome. The neat tree, with its clean, separate branches, has dissolved completely, exactly as I warned you it would, hours ago. What replaces it is far more intimate and far more human, not a tree of isolated species, but a web, a great tangle of populations meeting, mingling, loving, mixing across the whole old world for tens of thousands of years. The boundaries we drew between the kinds of human were real, but they were porous. When these peoples met often enough, they did not only fight, they embraced. Which brings us, finally, to the hardest and saddest question of all. Because if we mixed with them, if we carry them inside us, if there were children and gifts and tangled bloodlines, then in what sense did they die? And why did only we walk out the other side, the last kind of human on earth? It is time to stand where the bush narrows to a single twig and ask why. Chapter 19. The Last One Standing. So here we are. The question this whole journey has been walking toward from the very first footprint in the ash. For almost all of the human story, the world held many kinds of us. And then, in a geological eye blink, over the last 50,000 years or so, all of them vanished, one after another, until only a single kind of human was left. Us. Why? I have to tell you honestly at the outset, we do not have one clean answer, and anyone who offers you one is selling something. What we have instead is a convergence of causes, and the truth almost certainly braids several of them together, differently in different places. Let me lay out the real ones, because even our uncertainty here is illuminating. Part of it was numbers and connection. Our kind seems to have lived in larger groups, knit into wider networks, bands trading and talking and intermarrying across great distances, passing tools and ideas, and crucially, help along those threads. When a local disaster struck, a bad winter, a failed season, a people woven into a far-flung web can draw on distant friends, can move, can be rescued by the network. The Neanderthals, by contrast, seem to have lived in smaller, more isolated, more scattered groups. And a small, isolated population is terribly fragile. A run of bad luck, a few hard years, and it can simply wink out, with no neighbors to lean on. We may have survived less because any one of us was superior, and more because there were more of us, better connected, holding more hands across more distance. Part of it was flexibility. We were the ultimate generalists, eating everything, fishing, fowling, gathering, hunting anything that moved, endlessly improvising. Some of our cousins were more specialized, the Neanderthals leaning heavily on big Ice Age game. And we've seen all the way back with the Nutcracker Man what specialization costs when the world lurches. And the world did lurch. This was the Ice Age, a time of savage, sudden climate swings. When the climate convulsed and the great herds faltered, a flexible improviser bends and survives where a specialist breaks. And part of it, though here the evidence thins, and I flag it honestly as a strong possibility rather than a proven fact, part of it may simply have been the cruel arithmetic of being absorbed. Remember, when we met them, we had children with them, but there were far more of us than of them. And when a small population keeps breeding into a vastly larger one, generation after generation, the small one doesn't so much die as dissolve. Its bloodline diluted, spread ever thinner through the flood of the larger people, until no distinct population is left, only scattered fragments of DNA drifting in the descendants of the many. In that light, the most haunting reframing of all. Perhaps the Neanderthals and the Denisovans did not entirely go extinct in the way we usually mean. Perhaps, in part, they were taken in, absorbed, they became us. We are, in some measure, what they turned into. And I have to say the other quiet thing, because honesty has been our compass the whole way. Some of it was probably luck, contingency, chance. If a particular cold snap had fallen differently, if the dice of disease and weather and demography had rolled another way, perhaps it would be a Neanderthal voice telling this story now, wondering what became of the tall, thin cousins from Africa. We are not here because we were destined to be here. We were never destined. We are here the way that third small walker at Laetoli was there, through a long, unrepeatable chain of accident and circumstance, most of it invisible, none of it inevitable. The last twig on the bush is not the purpose of the bush. It is only the twig that, so far, hasn't been broken off. I want to end where we began, with a walk. With those 3 sets of footprints in the volcanic ash 3.5 million years ago, the small one stepping so carefully into the bigger one's tracks. I told you hours ago that everything was already in those prints, and I think you can feel now what I meant. They were one of many. We are the last of many. And the distance between them and us, the whole immense story of standing up and freeing the hands and the first sharp stone, and the marrow and the fire and the cooked meal shared in the dark, and the long helpless childhood, and the grandmother digging tubers in the heat, and the dead laid down with care, and the hand pressed to the cave wall, all of it, the whole longest story ever told, runs in an unbroken line from those footprints straight to you. To your own 2 feet that carry you the same way, to your own bad back, the tax on standing tall, to your own thumb, freed all those millions of years ago, to your own long childhood and the people who fed you through it, to your own grandmother. Even, quite literally, to your own blood, where the vanished cousins still live. We are not alone in the way we feel alone. Yes, we are the only kind of human left, the sole survivors, the last twig, and there is a real grief in that, a cosmic loneliness, when you think of the Neanderthal laying flowers, or the little people of Flores, or the Denisovan child whose fingertip taught us they existed. The world used to be full of other ways of being human, and we will never sit by a fire with any of them. That is a loss worth mourning, but they are not entirely gone. They are in our genes, and they are in our story, and now, having spent this time together, they are in your mind, real again, walking and hunting and grieving and creating, brought back for a little while by the simple act of remembering them. And that, in the end, may be the most human thing of all. No other creature does this. No other creature looks at a broken bone in the dirt, or a footprint in old ash, or a fragment of code in its own cells, and reaches back across millions of years to find its lost family, and aches for them, and brings them back to life in the telling. We became the kind of human that remembers. That is the inheritance those 3 walkers were carrying across the ash, without knowing it. Not the biggest brain, or the sharpest tool, or the hottest fire, the need to know where we came from, the need to not let the dead be nobody. You have just spent these hours doing the most ancient and the most human thing there is. You remembered. So tonight, look at your hand, spread the fingers, touch your thumb to each of them in turn, that precise, miraculous grip, 3.5 million years in the making. Feel your own weight balanced over your own 2 feet. And know that you are the latest link in the longest chain there is, the last living twig of a vast and vanished family, carrying all of them forward, every walker and toolmaker and firekeeper and artist and lost cousin, all the way down to you, standing upright on the earth, looking back and wondering. They would be so glad you were still wondering. That has been the story of how we became human.